We never lived in that house for long, did we? Number 42 it was. I remember the fish, do you? The angel fish on the tiles in the bathroom. Black and white it was. Number 74. A scream of silence. History is a pattern of timeless moments. T.S. Eliot from Little Gidding. I closed the gates across the drive and stood looking down the street. A street that my grandfather Victor would no longer move through. It was raining delicately, and there were the first signs of spring. A bird or two fluttered overhead, becoming more active in the trees at the junction with Goodmead Road. And I remember there were daffodils across the street in Mrs. Eliot's window boxes at number 51. The camellias in front of Little Gidding were in bloom, but even their pink blush did not lift my spirits. The house I knew would feel empty. I thought of the graveside from yesterday, looking down into the earth and thinking about poor Victor, lying in the coffin, boxed in the earth. When the first handful of dirt had landed noisily on the polished wood, the floral niceties and formality faded from my mind. All I heard was the dull echo of the soil, its hollowness, like a muted clarion call screaming. Jason was inside, and I heard him practicing his scales, his fingers dancing delicately over the keys with routine proficiency. And then, with only the merest hint of a pause, he played once more the piece he'd performed at the funeral, Satie's Nosien No. 1. I listened to its heartbeat pulsing and the gentle faltering of its melody as a car moved around the bend and drove by. Its powerful engine reminded me briefly of the old Rover that Victor had brought from Chislehurst all those years ago. He'd driven away and the engine would purr and then ease smoothly as he changed gear in its deep coasting thrum that resonated like the bass line of a long-held note, bowed so slowly as it rose up the scale. The vicar's words came back to me once more. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? The sting of death stung me anew, and I let the hot tears fall. For a few moments I was lost, standing at the gates and staring into the empty road. Alan, would you like a cup of tea? Mrs. Downey was standing on the doorstep calling me in. I'll be in a moment, Diana, I said, finding my handkerchief and wiping my tears. And then, despite my earlier observations of spring, I saw a flake of snow drift slowly down and settle at my feet. In a few moments, it was gone. Then another, and the darkness and the cold drove me inside, where I sat in the lounge watching the snow drift by the windows and collect in white eddies at the edge of the driveway. At another time, I'd have thought it beautiful, but the thought of the cold ground chilled me now. Diana brought me a cup of tea to the sitting room with 2 home-baked biscuits. There, she said, you don't want to be outside too long now, do you? I've left you a shepherd's pie to heat up and some nice green beans, enough for the 2 of you. Just try to get along. And you can leave the pots in to soak. I'll do those in the morning. She was buttoning her coat as she had walked in, and as she spoke, began tying her silk floral scarf with a knot just under her chin. There was a time that any woman would have done the same, to protect her coiffure, as if the wind could be so easily deterred. Thank you, I said, and sipped the tea. It was hot. I let my eyes drift back to the fire. Now I'll be off before this weather sets in much more. Just make sure you both get to bed before the temperature drops. It's going to be a cold one. Don't forget to fill your hot water bottles. They're on the side in the kitchen. She paused at the door and looked at me. I thought Jason's playing was superb. I said nothing. Good night, Alan. I am so very sorry about Victor. I pretended not to be aware of her and stared at the flames that flickered in a lively manner. And she left us. There I was in the sitting room, a fire flickering and a soft lamp burning. Jason was in the study, his fingers still moving smoothly over the keys. He had moved on to the piece he had been learning when he'd left, Chopin's Barcarolle in F-sharp major, Op. 60. It was a delightfully lilting mood that eased my mind, even in spite of myself. It could have been any ordinary evening from before, as if nothing had happened. I leant my head back to rest it on the chair, and listened. At one time, Victor would have sat with him in the evenings, wrapped in a blanket in his chair, listening to the soft melodies and contemplative sound. Jason paused at the end, then began once more a reprise of the church music, as if in his own private tribute of the Nosienne for Victor. At the last note of the evening, he would have gently applauded his grandson. But before Jason could reach the final bar, it went silent, and I heard the subdued sound of weeping. A few moments later I heard the soft closing of the piano's fallboard, the creak of the old piano stool, and then his footsteps on the silent stairs. He didn't say good night. I had tried not to imagine the coffin all this while, of course, to focus on the melody and the notes conjured in the Satie by Jason's more than adequate skill. But I saw it all again as it moved gently down the aisle of the church, the flowers a bright display of yellow and orange and red, in joyful contrast to the sedate, deep, burnished oak of the wood. Victor's choice. No white, he had said. I want it all bright, and something jolly for the final piece at least, please. You can all go out to Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 17. He'd planned the whole thing. Indeed, he had planned the whole thing. We should have guessed. Now the coffin is deep underground, 6 feet. Victor's eyes are closed, and his nose is pointing up only a few inches below the lining of the lid. A deep burgundy satin. Silk. I feel the sides of my chest tighten again, as if they will suddenly seize up. I lift my head and rotate it, easing the tension in my neck. The day had passed without any conflict with Jason. Perhaps we would be able to avoid it for the next few days too. I take a breath. Life is a beginning and an ending and a beginning, and to that there is no end. Victor had said that to me when we had had the funeral for my father in 1944. I'd only been 7 or 8. He had held my hand during the church service, and I remember the warmth of it. There had been a simple photograph at the front on a table draped in a cloth. My father in his uniform. But there was no coffin, no body. It had been obliterated somewhere over the English Channel. Any remains had fallen into the sea to become food for the fish. That was the end of him. Fish or worms, not much of a choice, I thought at that moment. But that moment of last farewell to my father was the day I saw Victor change from a grandfather into my new doting father figure. He took me to the Rec, he walked me to the shops, and on special occasions he bought me a toy car or a jigsaw. He took me to the library weekly, and we came back with book after book that he read to me. And he told me all about the world, and found a globe where I learned all about the Empire and about Scott and his adventures in the Antarctic. He'd taken me to see Mother at the hospital whenever he could. The rover would be brought out and I'd climbed onto the back seat, and then he'd glided smoothly out into the road and we'd headed off for Farnborough Hospital. They had told me that she would never recover by then, so I had stopped hoping for any improvement. I never liked going there really, but it was reassuring to see my mother's face at least. She'd wave at me from the window, but I wasn't ever sure if she knew it was me. She could as well have been waving at a cat. "Smile," Victor had said. "Keep smiling. It's all we can do, I'm afraid." "You look very smart," Victor said when I tried on the new uniform at the school outfitters. "Your father would have been very proud." He rested his hand on my shoulder as we looked into the floor-length mirror. I looked at the uniform for the grammar school. Its grey blazer made me look grown up and dignified, especially with the smart striped tie. The reflection looked like any other boy of 11, setting out on a journey to academic excellence. Except none of the other boys in my road would wear that particular tie. It alienated me from the group. They'd be playing at the Rec when I was bogged down in homework too. I'd already been warned about that by the teachers at Chislehurst Road Board School. I'd always thought it was odd that Victor still called it the board school. Of course, the teachers had said all these things to make me feel important, or even superior, as if it was down to their efforts, as if they had made me what I am. "You'll make new friends, Alan. You'll see." But Victor's words meant that any new friends would be at the other end of town, or even from other parishes, which were a world away. That autumn term, as I headed off on the bus for Crittle's Corner, I'd watch the other boys in their Ramsden uniform gather and begin walking in groups along the Court Road on the way to Gilman's Drive, and I thought about how there had been none of those divisions at the primary school. Everyone just wore a black and red cap, with the same Orpington buff cockerel stitched inside a red circle. But now we were being separated by colours and space and a different future. It was only later I learnt about the existence of a whole group of unseen neighbours hidden away in the trees of a gated community, who had been driven to school far away, to the better schools, with the better people, where they paid for everything. Better uniforms, better books, and better music, and a theatre and 3 different kinds of sport kit. People who had holidays abroad to exotic places, and spoke with different accents. I wondered if my father had survived, if he had managed to parachute out, or had landed his plane and climbed out of it before it exploded, whether we'd have been sitting there in the same uniform shop on the high street, or if I'd have been whisked off in a Bentley to some other select showroom, and if he'd have been with me, whether I would be trying on a different blazer for one of those special schools where you boarded, where you learned to wield power, and where people smiled enthusiastically at the mention of just the name Harrow, or Winchester, or Eton. The magic of those words held no power on my tongue, even when I did remember to articulate my T's and stress my H's, as Diana was always reminding me. "Well, don't you look super?" she had said, drying her hands on a tea towel when I tried it on at home and paraded round the kitchen. She put her arm on my shoulder and hugged me to her breast, and she seemed to be as happy with me as anyone else, so I pretended it was my mum who was hugging me. And although she wasn't the same age as Mum, she did all that Mum would do if she had been there. When she smiled, I leant forward and kissed her on the cheek. "Thank you, Diana," I said. "Such a fine little gentleman," she said, holding my hands and looking into my face as if I was saying goodbye. But then Victor had suddenly coughed, a menacing cough that I had not heard before. It was deep inside his lungs, as if there was some demon inside that he had to get out. He coughed and spluttered consistently for a few minutes. I suppose he was 71 by then, and that seemed ancient to me. But most old people coughed like that in those days. I thought it must just be part of aging. And in a way it was. So Diana didn't leave us, as I had feared, and she stayed to look after Victor, who grew more frail and delicate with every year, until he became confined to the house. I didn't make any friends at school. On my first day sitting in the building, it all seemed new and smart, as if no one had any friends or knew anyone else really. But that was just an illusion. It was old and established and set in its own private ways. There were quite a few new boys with me, and we used surnames only in those days. They were called Carrington, Stipley and McAllister. Well, while we were talking as we waited for a master to arrive and guide us somewhere for one of our first lessons, it soon became clear to me that I had a lot to learn. "So where do you live, Pugh?" Stipley asked. I'd already heard about how they lived in Chislehurst, or Keston Park, or Farnborough Park, and when I said I lived in Perryhall Road, they all turned their heads and went silent. They were too well brought up to say anything, of course, but they weren't experienced or astute enough to say something. There was a solid silence between us then, like a wall. I wondered if they did not know where it was, so I simply added, "It's along by the Priory, near Carlton Parade." And still they did not say anything. "You know, by the duck pond," I added. "We know," McAllister said, then, emphatically, to shut me up. "And what does your father do, Stipley?" Carrington said. "Oh, Daddy's a barrister," Stipley said. "And mine's working in the city," Carrington said. "And mine's something to do with Lloyd's," McAllister chimed in. "Is that the bank on the High Street?" I asked. "No, Lloyd's of London, insurance, the underwriters," McAllister explained. "And what does your father do?" Stipley asked me. "My father's dead," I said. "Oh," Stipley replied. "He was killed in the war." The master came along at that moment, and at break they were too embarrassed to find me or talk to me. I went up to them to see what might be happening, and Carrington said, "We are off to play football." And then they ran off. His stress on the pronoun had told me everything, so I stayed put and watched them from a distance. And then I decided to go off and find the library, where I sat in the oversized book section, looking at a map of the world in an atlas, memorizing the names of the largest rivers. Victor had signed me up for piano lessons when it was clear that I wouldn't get into any of the sports teams. I decided that for most things it helped if you had friends who could vouch for you, so I didn't stay after schools for practices. Instead, every Monday and Thursday, I'd stop off at Mrs. Court's house on Loxley Drive for a 30-minute lesson, then cycle back home through Poverest. That was where I met Elaine, her daughter. "You're really good at this," she said one day as I was leaving. "You must spend a long time practicing." "Oh, it's fine. Not too much hard work really, is it?" "I like it," I'd replied. "No, but really, I get to hear a load of kids through the week and they just plonk their fingers along and Mum gets quite annoyed that they don't practice. But when you come it sounds like something. Like a tune. It sounds like real music." "Thank you," I said. And so Elaine became my friend. "I like that one," she said after a year or so. "That's the Beethoven. Écossaise in E flat. But wait till you hear the Mozart, Sonata No. 16 in C major. It's quite beautiful." So I played it for her. Much of the time we did not talk. We did not need to say much at all. We either played or listened to music, and the sounds enveloped us, weaving our lives together. By the time I was 21, I was already giving lessons at home, using the front room that we called the study, where Victor had placed the baby grand that he had bought me when I had come of age. Whilst most of the people I taught were short-term, I realised I could spend my days helping others out, helping them to find music in some small way, to understand the emotional impact of it. Even the bread and butter kids, as Diana called them, whose grandmothers paid them to sit in my lounge for weekly practice sessions, plonking through their scales. I saw them as a noble challenge, to open up those little fingers and minds to the delicacy of music. I set out to share what always at some point in each day filled my room with the simple joy of emotion. I'd play for them at least one piece and then listen to their lesson. And if they did well, they'd get a chocolate biscuit. "You're giving away the profit," Diana would say wryly. She took away the empty cup and saucers and refilled the biscuit barrel before showing in the next schoolboy or girl. But Victor would listen, and he always encouraged me. He smiled and said, "It's an investment, Diana. We reap where we sow. Just look at how Alan has grown." And when I married Elaine in the following year, Victor was 82. So he moved himself into a room downstairs, like an annex, and he built on a bathroom. And Elaine came and lived on the upper floor with me, and she worked in a jeweller's on the high street. And we reaped where we had sown. And Jason came along in the spring of 1959. Diana was more than pleased to nanny him in the day, and have a family to look after once more, whilst Elaine specialised in fine diamonds and elegance. It was Christmas 1972 when things changed dramatically. We'd tried for another child, but there had been a few difficulties and Elaine had miscarried twice. The last one had been distressingly late. So we were wary until things settled down, and we were hopeful of a sibling for Jason when he was 13. The snow was falling early that year, and he and I had spent the day selecting, transporting, and setting up the Christmas tree in the lounge, while Elaine rested on the bed. She was due in April, so she'd have been 5 months pregnant, and things had seemed fine. She only worked part-time by this stage, taking more of a role in helping Diana with Victor, and she had stopped work with an extended leave of absence for the holidays, so we'd have been looking forward to a restful Christmas. I just finished threading the lights onto the foliage of the tree, and Jason and I were gingerly taking out the glass pendants and baubles. "Here, I like this one," he said, and took the fine cotton thread on the dangling spectacle of a long pendant glass decoration. It was a small sphere with a dropped cone of twisted sparkling glass, so that when it caught the light and glistened, it looked like a red star. Jason took another and carefully stepped around the tree, threading the next bauble on. I sat down and watched him from the piano and gently played the opening of the Coventry Carol. I remember how it was on the 14th bar, that interesting little F sharp on the bass clef. That's when I heard something crash onto the floor upstairs, and Elaine called out my name. Diana rushed over to stay in the house with Victor and Jason, and as soon as I had heard her key in the lock, we left, with me driving the Rover steadily down the street and turning up towards the hospital. I remember feeling my heart was going twice as fast as the indicators as I turned into the car park, but I tried not to panic and add to the fugue of the moment. It was a bit of a blur when I got there, but I remember there was a small decorated tree on a desk, and a phone kept ringing, and a child was running up and down, his feet slapping on the linoleum flooring. Slap, slap, slap. It made it real, vivid for me. Even now I can hear his mother's voice. "Peter, Peter, put your slippers on, you'll get cold feet." And somewhere there was a carol playing Good King Wenceslas. And that's when they told me there was nothing they could have done. She was gone. The baby too. They let me hold her for a few moments, and I remember thinking she had suddenly become something heavy. Just a thing. A piece of baggage that had to be manhandled. There was nothing of her left. She had gone and her body simply slumped against me. I looked down at her closed eyes, and a wail tuned up within me, its tightening talk like a piano's steel wire, screwing itself up into a scream. But I pushed it deep down, dampening it, then put my fingertips to her cheek, which felt colder already, as all warmth was ebbing away. "Goodbye, my dearest," I whispered, and kissed her brow. And when they passed me the baby wrapped like a gift in the tiniest blanket, his little body was nothing, just a whim almost, so frail and delicate. His naked toes were sticking out, and all I kept thinking was he'd get cold feet. And that other mother's words filled my mind. "You'll get cold feet, Peter. Peter, you'll get cold feet." And so I thought of him as Peter too, this little chap, another little one like the boy who would never grow up in the story. Too many endings mean that things really start to diminish a person's powers to begin again. Hard frosts kill any budding relief and can take an age to thaw. Things cannot grow in a winter of continued loss. I suppose I should have got help, but it wasn't something we did in those days. Another legacy of the war, I suppose. Just keep smiling, keep soldiering on. It was as if I was permanently stuck in a minor key, and silence became preferable. And so my soldiering on became a burial of emotions inside, and a retreat to a single chair where I'd sit in just pyjamas. I watched the sun rise palely over the frozen January ground, and became oblivious of the condensation that ran on the windows, or the kettle I'd left screaming on the stove, filling the room with a cloud of indifference. Diana would arrive and have to run in and turn it off. She'd find a blanket and wrap me in it, pour a hot drink, and then go off to sit with Jason. At first, Jason had come to sit in the same room as me. He watched me gently folding in on myself, and when he tried to speak to me I ignored him. I recalled Victor's past encouragement to smile. Keep smiling, it's all we can do. But the words were hollow platitudes now, futile comfort, it seemed to me. Why should we smile? He was hurting too, and I turned him aside. In the end, he moved straight from his bedroom to the study where he'd play all day until he too sank into an unspeaking silence. He said nothing all day. Whilst I was happy with the solidity and reassurance of this absence of sound, he wanted to fill it with noise. He'd sit staring at the piano and look ahead day after day, as if the gold letters of Bechstein were the only thing of permanence now, and he'd play Elaine's favourite pieces. He'd start with the calm and soothing majesty of Bach, his Goldberg aria, BWV 988 it was, delicate and sublime. He would sit alone as if his hands must never stop playing for her, as if spooling through the music from beginning to end and back over again and again was all that mattered. He kept her presence there, as if in accepting a total silence, she really would be gone. Elaine had played a recording of it when he was a baby, and I knew he was back in her arms at that moment, nestled in the security of those staves, resting in that sublime annotation. And then at other times he'd move onto the piano concerto No. 5 in F minor, the BMW 1056 Largo, meticulously playing each note as if his breathing was determined not by his will, but simply by every single sounding key that he pressed. I'd hear the piano's notes easing their way from the study, and they'd float harmoniously along the hall and find me in the lounge, or out in the kitchen wrapped in my blanket, my naked feet cold and unmoving on the floor, with a cooling mug of tea in my hands. Diana would drift between us like a ghost from our past, feeding us and providing us with drink and steadfastly determined not to come between us. And all the while Victor lay sleeping in his room, oblivious to our steady disintegration. I heard the piano's notes and the seductive sounds, like the voices of sirens luring me back to the painful rocks that were embedded in my memory. And it would have been reassuring for everyone if I could say that they gently find their way into my heart and mind and ease my pain too. But it was too soon, too raw, a naked emotion of loss. Even as Jason played the painful notes, I was listening for the strings to play the absent accompaniment, and I would simply be lying if I said that it brought any relief at all. The sounds to me became a torment. They felt like a knife, carving out the aching loss in me, defining the injury in me. So I shut out the sound, plugged my ears and held my hands to my head, wrapping myself in anything that was there, anything to fill those empty spaces in my mind that had been associated with Elaine and the sound of joy. Every note became a painful cut that sliced into me, so that when my tears would not stop, I had to stop the sounds, to drown them out, with at first a loud, constant humming from deep within me, and this grew to a wailing cry, louder with each repeated playing of the pieces, until I could stand it no more, and I left the house. I sat instead in the garden under the plum tree on a silent bench, whilst Jason played and played. I stayed until the frost fell upon me and my feet felt frozen in a welcome senselessness. As the winter deepened, In the end, I just wanted an end to be an end with no beginning. "Just stop playing!" I cried at breakfast the next day. "For God's sake, stop! You cannot make her live in the music." But he would not listen to me. He played right through, not hearing my words, oblivious to my hand on his shoulder. "Jason, please." He played on persistently, switching suddenly to bold Beethoven's March, the Variation 5, based on a theme by Dresser. Each note was a stubborn refusal to hear my words, and his fingers moved full of life across the keys, released in the altered melody. I wondered how to remove the problem from me, to stop the torment that it had become, and eventually I remembered the idea of going away to a boarding school, and what I thought it might offer us, a release for us both. And I thought how a school might even be a sanctuary for him, the best that money could buy. "What about a good school, Jason?" "One of the best." And he played on, ignoring what I said. "You could play all you like, and they'd look after you, better than I can here." "You can choose any school," I said. But he wouldn't stop to listen. He played on, returning to the Bach pieces, and as he began Bach's Prelude and Fugue in D major, I left the room. So then I just signed the papers anyway, and within 2 weeks it was all arranged. I had packed him a trunk, and it sat there waiting in the hallway. Still he remained at the piano stool, right till the end, playing on, hour by hour, minute after minute. "Enough!" I cried, lowering the full ball so that he was forced to remove his fingers. "Your taxi is waiting," I announced. He stared at the piano, its strings vibrating slightly still. "Father," he said, looking up at me for the first time in weeks, "please just listen to me." I waited, my mouth open and speechless, the heavy breaths of my anxiety audible to us both. But he had no words. He had nothing to say. The silence was still too much for both of us. As the taxi pulled away, I heard him call out, "Play something! Just play something, Father!" When he had gone, I closed the fullboard and locked it. "Play something, Father." The words haunted me. Play something. But I could not. Every note was a reminder of the loss, the ears that did not hear, and our shared joy that was no longer there to feel together, knowing everything in our tacit being. In time, I simply avoided the study too. I heard nothing from Jason for months. The schoolmasters reported that he was doing well in class, he attended all lessons, and would spend any other time in the music rooms, in a practice room, perfecting his piano. Their only concern was that he had not integrated with any of the other boys. He was often last to bed and first to arise, creeping off at dawn to play. Diana became very busy with Victor, whose health was deteriorating. "Play something, would you?" he said to me one evening. But I could not. And when he looked so disappointed, I left the room. The next time the doctor visited, Diana asked him to call in and speak with me. He suggested some medication to help me sleep. "It's fine, doctor," I said. "I have no problem sleeping." But I was lying. and lying there awake in the dark is not sleep. It is not rest. The mind fills every space of the room in the darkness. The expansiveness is exhausting. When Jason returned in the holidays, I would stay out of the house while he played. I sent him on overseas trips, and he'd go on musical tours with his school orchestra or school overseas expeditions to South America, Africa and Borneo, and he was glad to be away too, so we managed to pass by in an uneasy tension for a few weeks each year. When 3 years had passed after Elaine left, Victor's growths had swamped him. He would be dead before Christmas. I'd wanted to ask you to play something at the funeral when it comes, but I do understand, Alan, so I've asked Jason to play for me, he said. The Nosien, number 1, and then something a little more jolly, Mozart. He has agreed, so please let him play. I nodded and wrote it all down. And that was that. 3 weeks later, he was gone. 2 days after the funeral, there I am in the sitting room. The fire is flickering. Its uneasy light dances on the walls. It's warm and gentle, but unsettling too. I've left the piano unlocked for Jason's practice for the service and his evident desire to play whilst he is back at home. He had not said anything about wanting to play, but I have accepted it will happen. I've just tried to avoid those times with more walking and shopping and running errands away from the house. You play while I'm away, I said to him when he arrived back at the front door. But it is too cold for me to leave the house if he plays tonight, and I know he will want to play. I hear him sit in the study. The stool creaks as ever. I can almost hear his fingers poised, waiting above the keys, as if about to conjure life into being. Chopin's Barcarolle in F sharp major, Op 60, fills the empty spaces of the air. I'm too tired to think or feel, and just rest. Then, when it slowly begins, it works its slow magic, after all this time, and I feel it easing my mind, melting like snowflakes, cooling the warm earth outside. I feel at last as if it is any ordinary evening from years before, as if nothing has happened, even though I am painfully aware of the facts. I am exhausted after the last few days, so I lean my head back to rest it on the chair's wing and listen. Victor would have sat with him in the study on those evenings, so wrapped in my blanket, I stepped slowly towards his empty chair, listening to the soft melody's sensuous sound. I move into the study, and Jason pauses at the end of the Chopin Barcarolle in F sharp major, and begins once more a reprise of the church music from 2 days ago. As if, in this individual tribute, the Nosien is not just for Victor, but for me too now. As the last notes of the melody approach, he reaches the final bar, but stops. He senses me behind him, and he freezes. Please play on, I say tenderly. But he is still, paused, like the music, a gentle reverberation in the air that is suspended. And then, wanting the harmony to fill the gap that has been opened up in me for so long, I gently lift my hands and reach over his shoulder, placing my fingers onto the keys, pressing the notes to complete the sonata. Jason's hand closes over mine, and he brings my arms around him as we embrace awkwardly. I lean forward and kiss the head of the son I had buried in my losses and had abandoned in my grief. "I'm sorry," I say. In the silence that follows, I hear the subdued, deep breath that exhales from him, as if a rage has passed. It is as final as a death. Then, as the breath ends, I hear him inhale anew, deeply and vigorously, like a child opening his lungs at birth, and I realize I too am breathing deeply, and the tears of joy and sorrow fill my eyes with this ending and this beginning that I have delayed for far too long.